Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of Bookish, the casual book club.
Hi.
Where it's hi, Laura. Hi, Kofi. Well, today,
Hi.
Laura,
How are you?
Kofi, we're talking about children's books. So I'm actually really excited about this topic because it is reflective of where I am right now in the majority of my reading. Is reading to my children or with my children. So we're going to be talking about children's books. We're going to be talking about what makes a good children's book. Laura has some stuff to share with us on that. But I thought to get started, I'd just ask you guys, what are some of your earliest or your favorite children's books that you remember reading growing up as a child?
Hmm. I had this conversation with a colleague of ours, and I don't think I started reading children's books other than the Dick and Jane books. And I don't know if I was actually reading those as I was looking at the pictures and figuring out the meaning of what was going on. I think my first real reading dealt with more comic strips and comic books.
Yeah.
Um, that kind of became the thing for me to in terms of reading. Um, and again, you have those books that are geared towards um, student reading, or if you're a child. But then there were things that I liked looking at, like the Superman comic books or the X-Men comic books. And because my mom collected comic books, so she kind of introduced that to me fairly early when I was pretty young. I don't remember how old I was, but I remember really sitting and looking at the pictures, looking at the characters, fight one another with the exaggerated pow and boom. And I thought that was very interesting. And so those are the sort of fond memories of me reading something that was, I guess it could be considered for children, but comic books can have adult themes as well. But yeah, comic strips like this Family Circus, the Archies, Josie and the Pussycats. That was also a comic strip and a comic book. So these were things that my sister and I would read and trade, and then we had friends who also read some of these things, and we would read and trade. So I didn't really get into children's books until much later, and in fact when I started having children.
Yeah. How about you, Laura?
Well, I grew up in Korea until I was 10. So in Korea, I do have distinct memory of my prized possession was this set of like many, a collection of Disney stories in Korean, obviously, and picture books. And I would devour those and I would read those every night. And my mom loves to tell stories about how I would pretend to read, by kind of memorizing some of the words that I had heard my mom reading to me and kind of using context clues to pretend to be reading those books to people. And then when I came to the States, my first books that I was introduced to were the like Dick and Jane what primers, is that that's what they're called,
Mhm. Yeah.
and Shel Silverstein's um, oh my gosh, what is it? Where the Sidewalk Ends. And those are the books my cousin, who was then in middle school or high school, I guess, had used to teach me English, because I didn't know any English when I came here, and my family lived with her for a few months, and I remember her introducing me. She was so excited to teach me English with these books. So still now, I really love Shel Silverstein, and I've collected his books, and I introduced them to my kids. So yeah, those are my early memories of children's books in America for sure. Yeah.
Hmm.
How about you, Sylvia?
I recall, um, I don't know where I got these books. They just, I think I got them like as hand-me-down books from my parents' friends, other kids, but they were like the little like golden books, the little ones where it's like there's that roly-poly puppy and like there's one book called like Are You My Mother, which I thought was so strange. Like, how can you not know what your mother looks like? You know, but then interestingly, the most memorable books I have recollection of is belonged not to me but to my piano teacher, who she was a very scary woman. But I really disliked piano lessons. But the one thing that made me look forward to it was that she had this extensive collection of Korean folk tales, written for children and
Mm.
like illustrated really like beautifully, and she had them on her bookshelf. And so after I was done with my piano lesson and my brother would do his piano lesson, I had like that 30 minutes where I could just read all of the folk tales, and they're written in Korean and in English. And so I just loved those books. To this day, I still try to find them, but I can't. I don't know where they are. They must be out of print. But yeah, those are the ones I remember reading. Those and like you said, Laura, Shel Silverstein, Where the Sidewalk Ends was really important for me because it was the first time I read like children's literature where it was okay to like hate school and and be a little irreverent.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then I remember also my second grade teacher, Mrs. Lickingbill, used to at the end of the school day read to us, and that's where she read like the BFG, and some of the other Roald Dahl books, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And I've
Mm.
actually started to read those books with my children. Now we're going through the whole like Costco had it on sale, the whole Roald Dahl collection, and so my son's been really enjoying it. So we're reading Matilda right now, which I also remember really enjoying. But it's weird, and this is my next question for you guys. As an adult, have you revisited or reread some of the things that you may have read as a child? Because we're rereading Matilda, and my husband and I both take turns to read it to our kids, and we're like, we have to censor some parts because I was like, oh my gosh, this lady is abusive. Like she would be going to prison right now, like some of the things she says to them and does to them. So I was like, I don't remember like absorbing this information in quite the same way, but so much of the books that we've been reading have to do with, I was thinking back, have to do with how terrible adults are to children and how like what a dangerous world this is for children, and you see that theme, I think, play out in a lot of fairy tales, Hansel and Gretel,
Yep.
of the Western tradition, but even like in some of the Korean folklore I read, women and children didn't fare much better. So I
No,
thought,
no.
oh,
Yeah.
so much of children's literature is about how terrible adults are to children.
Yeah,
But
there are these serious morals to stories,
yeah, like
and
survival.
those morals, yeah, death will happen if you don't follow, the right edicts and the right things. Yeah, I've noticed that about German folk tales, and for some reason, I don't know how I got this book. Um, my wife and I had this children's book of Chinese stories for children, and a lot of the dragons ate the children. And I was reading one of them, and I thought, I don't think I should read this. This doesn't seem like a good story to read to a child about to go to sleep. Um, and so, yeah, one of the books that I have revisited that, it wasn't necessarily one of my favorite books, but The Cat in the Hat. Um, a lot of the Dr. Seuss books I started reading with my kids, along with Mo Williams's Piggy and Elephant, or Elephant and Piggy series.
Mhm.
And those are some of the stories that I like to read because I can affectate a voice in a way that makes it interesting and makes the reading fun for me and my kids, or at the time. Now my kids are kind of old, they don't want me to read at all to them. But yeah, I think that like I haven't been able to really introduce my kids to comic books because that seems passe with all the Marvel movies and the DC comic movies out. So there's something lost in that. But in terms of children's books, I think there hasn't been too many that I've really gone back to because I didn't read that many of them when I was a kid. And so the stuff that I did read, my kids aren't interested in, so woe be to me.
I you know when I read children's books that I as adult think that are great and my kids love, like sometimes I do think like I kind of missed out growing up with these books, right? And I don't know, beyond that one set of Disney stories that I remember, I don't know what access to books that I had as a child. Like I don't remember library. I also for several years in formative years, I lived in a very remote part of the country in Korea. So there was definitely no access to a public library. But my parents definitely valued reading. So I know there were books around, but I just can't remember um, what they were. I have thought about the Piggy and Elephant books. I love those. Mo Willems books are so wonderful. And one of my favorites, one of my kids' favorites, is the one that is what is it called? We're in a Book. It's
Yes.
do you know that?
Yes,
Do you guys know that one? So
Yes.
I
I
do.
love that one. I mean, it's of course basically it's self-aware, right? As it's meta and anything where they break the fourth wall or whatever. My kids just love that idea. I think they recognize that it's a sophisticated idea, right? Where the characters and this fictionalized world is aware of itself. It kind of happens in cartoons sometimes, like in Teen Titans Go. My kids love to watch that. Um,
Yeah.
and so those books that I would sort of see as being clever, like or books with book with no pictures. Yeah, like those kind of books that are very clever. I really enjoy reading. I enjoy it more than my kids really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's funny, Kofi, that you mentioned the dragon because usually like in like European like stories where a dragon appears, they're like a lot scarier. You're thinking like the Hobbit, Desolation of Smaug, right?
Right.
They're like greedy and they're like, mean. But usually in Asian like myths and fairy tales, dragons are kind of like a little bit happier. They represent good fortune, like every new year, the dragon kind of brings it in, that kind of a thing. So that surprises me that, the dragon would gobble up the children. But I think my kids would actually interestingly adore that type of thing. They love the idea. They seem to like, they get scared. Like my son will be reading a scary part in the story and he'll walk away and he'll stand outside the door. And I'm like, do you want me to stop reading? And he's like, no, I'm listening. But he listens from outside the door. And then he'll come back in, but he doesn't want me to stop like reading the story. He needs to know what happens. So I just thought it's interesting, like the level of tolerance that, kids will have for books. But I also really like these days like speaking of access, Laura, I feel like there's so many more like people writing children's books from different perspectives that it's really exciting to me to read these books with my kids. And so there are books about like, immigrants, right? So there's this one book that I often, I have it here. It's beautiful. It's written by a poet too, that I often recommend to my friends. And it's called A Different Pond. And it won, I think like a Caldecott or one of those awards. And I love it because it's written from the perspective of a child whose father, I think they're Vietnamese immigrants, goes fishing, and they compare it. The father compares it to fishing in a pond back in Vietnam with his brother, and this is a different pond. That's why they call it A Different Pond. And I really love being able to share those types of stories with my kids too, because I feel like it was so rare for me, besides those like Korean folk tales that I read, to see books where, it may have reflected my own experience in some way, shape, or form, and or spoke to an interest that I may have had. Whereas now I feel like you can find a children's book. There's everywhere, and the idea of access. We have a great library system, and there's even a Maryland book bank where folks can go and pick up books for free, and you can donate books. And I just love this idea of things being available to kids and to people, no matter, you know, if you're in the county, they're available to you. And so I think it's such a different era now, I think, for literature too. It's really fascinating to me. But
I think
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
that brings up a good point about like the article that I mentioned to you guys a little earlier about, it's called "What Makes a Children's Book Good," and it's a short article from the New Yorker from 2016, that talks about like what are the factors, like how do you determine whether or not a book is a good book. And he talks about, the author is Adam Gidwitz, and he talks about sort of two different like measurements, I guess. One is content. And sometimes people ask questions, you know, consider the content. And these days, a lot of concerns about should a book be socially conscious, right? And raise important issues that kids should be aware of. So when you were mentioning like diverse writers, for example, I really like that book, Island Born by Junot Diaz. And it's about this girl who lives in America and wants to write about like there's a school assignment where she writes about her family or where her family's from, and she hasn't been there, right? So she talks to the people in the community and her family to learn about the island. And so we kind of go on this journey as these people are telling her, the girl, about the island. And so I think books like that probably maybe fall under that idea. And then the other idea is about, he calls it results-oriented approach of measuring a successful book, as in they sell a lot, which means that kids are devouring it, right? Like they are interested, they can't put it down. And those, we're talking about things like R.L. Stein. What are the books called again?
Creepy, scary stories to tell in the dark. Yeah, Goosebumps.
Yeah, Goosebumps, or Harry Potter, right? So there are these different ways of thinking about, and then like children's like psychologists, for example, talk a lot about the psychological value of a book. What does it do? So I just want to read you this one quote where this child psychologist, Bruno Bettelheim, explains he believed that a good book would, quote, promote the child's ability to find meaning in life. It must stimulate his imagination, help him to develop his intellect and to clarify his emotions, be attuned to his anxieties and aspirations, give full recognition to his difficulties, while at the same time suggesting solutions to the problems which perturb him, end quote. That's a lot for a book to do. But I can think of lots of books that do some of those things, right? One of my favorites is What Do You Do with an Idea? Do you guys know that series? Another one is called like What Do You Do with a Problem? What do you do with and I really like this. It goes on the journey of like this like cloud of a problem is hanging over this kid's head, and he tries to avoid it. He tries to like, whatever. And then at the end, the suggestion is like, you have to deal with it head on, right? And so on. So it has that kind of psychological value, it's socially conscious, I guess. I don't know. But there is that general basic factor of like, do kids want to read it? Is it fun? Right? It has to have that. Otherwise, no matter what good lessons that come at the end, if the kid wants to put it down after 2 pages, it's not going to have that impact,
Which is, I think, unique from like adult books, because in adult literature, like you seek out like a topic that you're interested in. Like that's the reason why you will pick that book. I think for children it's similar, but more of them, I found that, I could pick up a children's book about any topic and still be entertained in some way. But those criteria, I was thinking about it, like that does seem like a tall order, but I was also thinking like, but isn't that the literature aspect of literature, in like how our like human issues are reflected back to us, and it can take this like the shape of any one of these story contexts as its like vehicle, but really all of it is sort of, unless it's like, Fly Guy presents bats, which my kids also really like. These like straight up informational, like, whatever. But even then, they're trying to be, entertaining at least. I don't know about whole anxiety. Maybe my kids have bat anxiety now, but like it's producing anxiety, but I don't know if it's like helping to like
Fly Guy is
grapple with
gross.
it. I know.
Yeah, I wonder.
But I do.
I wonder. Good. No, I was going to say,
No,
I
go ahead.
wonder how would. No, I was going to say, how would like Captain Underpants fit into the literary thing? Because my son really liked that series when he was like 11 and 12. I think it was probably a bit beyond his age range, but he really liked that book. That and Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And so my daughter started reading them because she saw her brother reading them. But yeah, it's interesting how, at least with my children, I've watched them progress out of the sort of Dr. Seuss, Mo Willems books into these other, books that I'm just like, oh, okay. My daughter got into this Dragon series book, and and they're her age. She's 13, but she read all of them and would not watch with the Desolation of Smog. She didn't think that was real enough. Just so that was the wrong kind of dragon, I guess. And I don't know. I just find it interesting that once not students, my children, I guess they're students too, start that love of reading. If you can get them to sustain it for a long period of time, I think that has long-term benefits for their education and just for them as people to sort of see how the world can be imagined and realized. But I haven't used books that are specific to social issues. I think that's real current right now, and I'm not 100% sure if I'm fully on board. I'm not off board, but I'm not on board either.
Why? Why is that, Kofi?
Well, it depends on the book. I think it also depends on the story, and sometimes when it's so socially conscious, it might elicit types of questions that I'm not 100% sure every parent is able to answer. And for those who can, that's great, but it's those who can't that I wonder about. And so even the idea that because someone buys a book that they're reading the book, I don't know if that's always true. But when it comes to kids literature or kids fiction, I do wonder if we are imposing a perspective that is, not necessarily something they would naturally come into on their own, which I think stories and children's stories in particular, and sort of piggybacking on what the article that Laura you shared with, it feels like stories should lead kids into these spaces and not so much tell them what the space is and define the space for them. That's the wonder I have in that. But I also had a book about a Black girl with hair, and my daughter has Black hair because she's African American. And that's an issue with a lot of young Black women or young girls, what to do with their hair. So I can't say I don't use those books because I just thought about it. But ultimately, would I give that book to you and Laura, Sylvia? No, because you have, sons who I don't think want to have cornrows in their hair, but maybe, maybe. I don't want to limit them, but I think that certain things, not everything is for everybody, I guess is my bottom line point. But yeah,
I think you
I
bring
do
up a
wonder.
really. Oh, I was just saying, I think I really appreciate what you're saying, Kofi, because I think there's a couple of threads in there that I recognize. And one of them is that, children's literature is such a powerful influence in like the formative years of our children, right? Like it really has the power to develop and inform the way that they think and set that foundation. So, if and adults have a role in that too, because at that young age, you're providing that access to them and oftentimes picking out what they're going to read, or at least, other people might be doing that, teachers, for example. But if you don't follow that up with some thoughtful, interaction, then, you leave a lot up to, interpretation, for the kid, but depending on the book. But I also think, at the same time, you're right about like children's literature leading kids to, as they grow older and as they're developing, to these like broader questions about some of the social issues, especially that are taking place. So like, I think the abundance now of young adult fiction, I think speaks to that, like that pivotal moment, right? When a kid is becoming an adult and is now like going into these spaces where they're considering all of these social issues. I remember like when I was like in that young adult phase, there weren't a ton of like young adult fiction was not what it is now. And I remember one of the first books I just happened to read was The Handmaid's Tale. And I was like, what is this? And the thing about Margaret Atwood and The Handmaid's Tale is that it's never like some of the books you might see now where it's like, hey, these are terrible issues. It just was terrible. Everything was terrible, that's happening in the book. And as a reader, you have to wrestle with and grapple with kind of like what that person was saying, Laura, that you were reading from. You have to deal with all of these anxieties, these questions, and you're really wrestling with it in the book. But I had never read anything like that before. So it was my first sort of exposure and experience with that. So I track with what you're saying, Kofi, and I can definitely see that point of view. But
yeah. I think the other thing too is that I think about and of course we're making these choices for our children, right? Because the children, until they're sort of an age where they might want to go to the bookstore or library and browse and pick their own books, especially early on, you're sort of guiding them or choosing the books for them. And one thing that I've been thinking about is sort of the names of the authors, and I want them to see and hear like Asian American names on the covers of books, because that was definitely something I didn't have, right, growing up. So like Jason Chin has these series of like really beautifully illustrated books about nature, and or like Junot Diaz talking about Island Born, or there's a Korean American. There are lots of Korean American children's book writers, and one of them is called Where is Harmony? And it's beautifully illustrated with the author's name. I forget the author's name now, but I think that's another thing that I want to see. I want to make sure that my kids they're exposed to a variety of creative things that Asian people do, for example, and be exposed to that, and then so that becomes a normal thing, right? And I think the children's literature sort of is pretty. There are a lot of diverse writers, as you mentioned, and I think that's a real gift. That's really important, I think, so that they can see that's like, oh, I too could be a children's book writer. If you don't see it, it's hard to imagine, right? I can't believe it, but I think we're almost out of time. So anybody want to say one last thing before closing?
Yeah, the book that I was talking about with the black hair is I Love My Hair by Natasha Terpley.
Hathaway's the poet. Sorry.
Yeah.
My kids read that in school.
Yeah. But my daughter we had a copy of it for my daughter, and I think Angie and I both read it. to her, and yeah, and so she still loves her natural hair. And I think that I don't know if that book helped her. My wife has locks, so that's another thing. But I think the ideal is seeing yourself in the book. I think that's where you were going with Laura. That not only having the names, but seeing yourselves in the book. And on that level,
right.
I'm with it. I'm with that.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us for this episode on talking about children's books. Please check us out and our past episodes on dragondigitalradio.podbean.com. You can also look us up on Facebook, Bookish, a casual book club. I do want to give a shout out to Kimberly and Christina who commented on our post. I posted something this morning about on our Facebook page about favorite children's books, and Kimberly said Dr. Seuss and Llama Llama Red Pajama series. And and she mentioned How Do Dinosaurs series, which I really love that. And then Christina just wrote too many to list, ! Right. So thank you guys for visiting us on Facebook and commenting. I hope you'll join us next time. Bye, everybody.